We're getting started. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Today we're gathered for a work session on AO 2025-97, an ordinance of the Anchorage Assembly submitting to the qualified voters of the municipality of Anchorage a ballot proposition amending the home rule charter to authorize a tax on short-term rentals. We'll start with, that's AO 2025-97. We'll start with introductions. Mr. Gerker.
Jared Gerker.
Anna Brawley.
Christopher Constant.
Daniel Boland.
On the phone, we have Mr. Martinez.
Present, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Myers.
Yes, thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Anyone else on the phone? Nope. Okay. Joined by council. It's quiet City Hall. We might see some other folks wander in. Parking is a bit of a trick with AFN. So today, again, we're here for a work session to discuss a charter amendment proposal drafted by myself and Mr. Volin. Mr. Volin, you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. So we have two documents that members may find helpful. One is that summary of economic effects. I believe that was also circulated to your email inboxes. And so folks can see some of the projections made by the administration. And in particular, looking at years 27 through 30, about $4 to $5 million would be the annual projected revenue via this 5% short-term rental tax. So take a look at that when you have a moment, if you haven't already. Another document that you'll have before you or is also available online is in response to a question that I believe it was Member Johnson asked. He wanted to know about other jurisdictions. And so Legislative Services helped us do some research and put this together and essentially come up with what would be the aggregate tax rate and how that's broken out. So we looked at some of the sort of resort communities because, similarities to Girdwood, for instance. We also looked at other jurisdictions that are of a similar size to Anchorage. And so you can see that they have their underlying room or lodging tax. Some of them have an additional short-term rental tax, and then some of them also have sales taxes. And then the aggregate is in that right column. So, looking at a place like Carbondale, Colorado, for instance, that has a population of 6,000, that's sort of a Colorado resort town. They have a lodging tax of 2%, which is less than our 12%. However, they also have a 6%, an additional tax equal to 6% of the gross rental price paid by any customer of any short-term rental. And then they also have an 8.4% minimum combined sales tax rate, bringing their aggregate tax rate to 16.4%. You could also look further down at a place like, let's see. Let's look at maybe Reno, Nevada. They have a 13% or 13.5%, depending on which tax district you are in, based on their room or lodging tax. They don't have a short-term rental tax, but however, they do have a permit that's required. And then a city license tax of 1% or 1.5% of gross receipts. And then the state and county have a combined sales tax of 8.27%. So that brings their sort of overall aggregate up to 13.5%. So anyway, you can look through that. I think it is worth noting that some of these, Napa, California, for instance, their aggregate tax rate is 20.75%. And so that is certainly higher than what our combined short-term rental tax and room tax of 17% on just the short-term rentals. So that's that on that. And then we also were submitted some questions, myself and Member Constant, that came through the clerk's office by Member Brawley. And so I just kind of have that all in notes form. And I think I'd like to go through that really quickly because she asked some very thoughtful questions. So her first question was, what types of housing and infrastructure would this tax support? So I said, here are some ideas. Actually, sorry, let me pull up. I have an edited copy of this. Okay.
I'm going to add something.
Go ahead.
Note also that Ms. Silvers and Mr. Rivera have joined us on the phone. Are you there, Ms. Silvers?
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you. Are there Mr. Rivera?
I'm here.
All right, thanks. So one thing that we want to point out just up front is that there are a lot of questions about how this could work, but the way that the charter amendment proposal is structured is that it will by ordinance be established. And so if the voters approve, any number of these items are flexible depending on the intent and will of the body at the time when the question of formulating the actual program is established. And so we did not want to put too much structure into the charter. The charter should be a general document. The code should be the specifics. So just keep that in mind. There are a number of answers where it's choose your own adventure.
Yes. Okay. So what types of housing and infrastructure would this tax support? Within the dedication clause of, quote, only for the purpose of supporting development of housing and related infrastructure, unquote, that's from page 2, line 36 of the ordinance. The assembly by ordinance or resolution, or the administration by action or proposed legislation, can determine what the funds are spent on. There will require implementing code by ordinance and likely amendment to AMC 12.20.020, which also contains refined implementation language for room tax dedicated to convention centers and to tourism promotion. But here are sort of some of the ideas that I have for, the types of housing and infrastructure. Funded activities may include new construction, acquisition, or rehabilitation activities. Many types of housing could be supported: efficiency suites, multifamily apartments, missing middle like duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, townhomes, micro units. Removal of vacant and abandoned properties that are beyond repair could be included in the purposes of the fund. Support for commercial to residential conversions, like the assembly did when we used ARPA funds to partner with groups like Rasmussen or the Anchorage Affordable Housing and Land Trust. Installation of utilities or utility upgrades where they might be needed to catalyze specific sites for development, such as Third and Ingra, the National Archives site, Totem property. Those things could be funded, those needed utilities. Off-site improvements like roads to a new subdivision or sidewalks near multifamily housing. The fund could also support assistance for low and moderate income home buyers, such as down payment assistance, education, or counseling. The next question, Member Brawley asked, would the overall goal be to put funding toward one or two big projects or gap funding for several small projects? And so my answer to that is either or both. The tax is projected to generate about $4 to $5 million per year. It's important to acknowledge that the fund wouldn't necessarily have to be tapped every year, but could be built up over a few years. The administration and the assembly could work together to prioritize one large project, or the administration, another example of how it could work, they could put out an RFP and select smaller projects to support based on those responses and bring those ideas before the assembly. Next question was, what is the general intention for administering and deciding how the dedicated fund is spent? Through real estate, chief financial officer, OMB, mayor's office, or are they all assembly direct appropriations? My response is that this would likely be decided by future assembly ordinance along the lines of what Member Constant was stating, which can include some parameters for the decision-making process. However, my personal intent and preference is that the administration would bring concepts to the assembly for decision. We could also work with industry experts to create a strategic guide similar to the one we created for the alcohol tax, which would help us understand what the greatest needs or barriers or expenses are when it comes to housing construction and help us prioritize investments in a way that will maximize the impact of the housing fund. Also similar to the alcohol tax, the administration could bring the proposal as part of their budget process, and that would be subject to assembly amendments. Next question, would an existing board or advisory body be used for this or one created? And would that be decided now or during implementation? My response, that would be decided during implementation. My preference, however, would be maximum creativity and flexibility for the policymakers in the administration and on the assembly. Next question, are there any intended excluded uses for the funds, as in things outside the scope of a housing fund? So some examples that Member Brawley put forward were purchasing land, renovations only, requirements for affordability or certain types of housing, a minimum density threshold, projects in certain areas or not certain areas, projects using tax incentives, deteriorated areas, other existing financial tools. My response was, I need maybe more context for what outside the scope means. I'm not sure if there's a set in stone definition of a housing fund scope that I can think of, but I could see the fund supporting renovations if they add housing units or convert to residential uses. We could also, again, the body working together collectively could state excluded uses in an implementing AO in code. And then the next question, the intent is stated to not reduce or restrict the number of short-term rentals operating. If this is an impact, however, and there is less revenue from short-term rentals over time as their number reduces, would it impact or narrow the intended uses of the fund? What would be prioritized? So my response is there are always economic pros and cons to weigh. If there are less short-term rentals over time, that may be a housing supply and cost benefit for Anchorage residents. Less short-term rentals would mean less revenues collected, but would likely mean more long-term units available for purchase or rent, which is a goal of the fund and of plans like 10,000 homes in 10 years and the Housing Action Plan. However, I am doubtful that we would see a large reduction in the number of short-term rentals, particularly luxury units, with an additional 5% tax paid not by the owners themselves, but by those who book stays. The summary of economic effects analysis draws this conclusion as well, based on data and economic trending. And the final question from Member Brawley, if excluding owner-occupied properties, which is a proposed amendment, how much would that reduce the revenue estimate, and does this impact the possible uses of the fund? She said, as part of her question, very rough estimate she had received from the administration that the 5% on short-term rentals as currently written is likely at or just under $3 million per year. And so my response was to refer to the summary of economic effects, which provides higher projections in out years, again, about 4 to 5 million. And excluding owner-occupied would doubtless have an effect on the revenues collected. However, I don't anticipate that it would impact the possible range of uses of the fund. So those are my responses to Member Brawley, and I think that's all I have for now, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, I have a couple of things to add. So I think there are very few more enduring questions that we receive, at least I have received over my many years of service, about what are we going to do about the fact that short-term rentals are proliferating into our residential neighborhoods. And there have been a lot of folks who've asked questions about the intent of this in relationship to making an effort to reduce the number of short-term rentals. And that was and continues to be not part of the proposal that we are looking at. And in fact, we had said that before the statement of economic effects or summary was produced, and the document confirms that that will not actually happen in any likely situation in the face of this proposed revenue measure. And so that is one thing I want folks to understand, is that is not the intent. And if it happens, it happens. But just like all of our proposed and current use taxes are all subject to the same fundamental challenge. That is, if users are fewer, there is less money. You can do less with it. And so that's just a simple truism or a fact related to a use-based tax. And so we don't feel that that's really a meaningful concern to the question. Now, the thing that we are trying to solve, I think it's important for people to understand, because in the media circles and when the lobbyists approached us from Airbnb, they made all kinds of arguments. One that seemed pretty reasonable, that it's not fair to tax us different than hotels. Why are you creating a separate tax for just these short-term rentals? And the answer is actually pretty straightforward. The fact is, there are really no hotels that are operating in residentially zoned districts. But every time an Airbnb in a residentially zoned district opens up, it is one less residential unit available that's functionally being used for a commercial purpose. So they are fundamentally different than the actual hotel units. And so that is the rationale for why a specific tax on a specific type of property because it is having a specific impact on a specific type of zoning district. And the zoning district that it is impacting is the one we're having the biggest challenge with, which is residential housing units for our neighbors. And so now, recognizing that I had previously stated we're not intending to try to reduce the number, and the data demonstrates that it won't likely do that. What we are trying to do is solve for the conundrum that we face, that we don't have resources to take care of fundamental infrastructure challenges relating to stranded properties, deteriorating properties, properties that could become viable residential units or returned to viable residential use in the residential districts. And so that's kind of the gist of this approach, which is, okay, we recognize this is a market in this town. It's having an effect on a certain part of the neighborhoods, and that's having an effect on our housing stock available for residential. So let's use this as an opportunity to generate more housing opportunities in our town. It's a virtuous cycle as opposed to a vicious cycle, what is proposed here. So that's kind of the framing of the approach that we're putting forward. It's targeted, it is narrow, it is intended to fix a very specific challenge. So that's the kind of basis of the factors that we've put before you. Yep, Mr. Kirker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No, I know that Member Brawley has a proposal out as well. And if I'm putting you on the spot, you don't have to answer this, ma'am, but how much does your tax generate compared to this one in front of us? Like, what's the comparisons of the two?
Well, I'll just say, I know that that item was not included as part of this work session, but I did request a summary of economic effects, and it'll be on the agenda.
Okay, all right, thank you.
I think it's safe to say substantially more, because it's general, it is across all of the types of properties, and it has more specific different purposes. So I think that's a fair thing to kind of answer that question. Much bigger. Anna?
Yeah, thanks. And I'll say first, thanks for considering my questions. And I think I've said before on the record, just generally, I've worked on implementation of alcohol tax even before I got to the body. I've worked on the ACE fund, both setting up the board and dealing with what the possible uses of that fund would be, or the process for deciding that. We've seen for the last few years the CASA process, and really trying to wrestle with some operational implementation pieces that were not contemplated when it was brought to the body by some advocates and worked on at that time. And then also Project Anchorage. I know a lot of my concerns with that proposal were really how it works with this process, or what the actual implementation would be. So I bring all those up only to say a lot of my questions are not targeted only at this item, but to say we need to think about those things. So I appreciate the answer that we don't need to answer all those questions now. So part of it was just trying to understand sponsors' intent. For example, should things be excluded? And again, like, not necessarily something we need to decide now, but if there is something clear, because if someone says, oh, I want to fund, paving a road to existing housing, right? Like, it's helpful to have boundaries on what the funds are for. Anyway, so all that to say, that's why I'm very focused on implementation, because my lived experience, and presumably maybe I will be here to do it, to do it on the other side, or to help with that. So I'm trying to think ahead and avoid some of these issues that we've had on the other end of when something passes. My two, well, actually, one of my questions was addressed, the owner occupied. I think that would be helpful, at least to understand if that amendment is brought forward, what share, if we know what share of rentals are in that category. Because if it's 80%, that's a different impact than 20%, right? So I just would be curious. And then also, I wonder if the sponsors have contemplated the bigger, I guess, opportunity cost in the future. So one thing on my mind is that this functionally increases the bed tax, or at least it is in addition to what we have on one type of rental, short-term rental. And therefore it would be at 17%, and then hotels would be at 12%. So the question that I'm thinking about, for the body 10 years from now that I would not be on is, unless I'm a Dick Cheney, I guess, but it's not my intent. Anyway, would we then be saying 12% is the cap, or would we contemplate possibly a hotel only tax? And I wonder what that would do. So that's, I guess, one thing I just want to put on the table as a something to contemplate, right? Is that when we increase the tax, it may make it very difficult to change in the future. But again, maybe that's not, maybe 12% is the max that we should do, right? There's not an infinite percent. But anyway, so that's another kind of thing I just
So
wanted to
I
put
would
on the
like to
table.
respond to that.
Yeah.
The reality is, I think we can look at least two tax streams or revenue streams right now that we are in the process of revising and reassessing, and a third one on the table, and some of it is related to this bed tax. And so I think that for my part, I'm not afraid that the future assembly will have their hands tied by our actions unless it's language that is very specifically put in the charter, like if there is a proposal to add the owner occupied exemption to the charter. I think that's not a great idea. I think it is a great idea to add the owner occupied exemption, but do it in the code. And so if we bind in the charter language too narrowly the functions, then you do tie the hands of future entities. But that still doesn't mean you can't make changes at that time, as we are contemplating now and have just finished the contemplation of the 4% of the tourism marketing tax related to the bed tax. And as we're discussing relating to the capital funds, and we're proposed to use the ML&P sale fund to pay off bond expenditures so that we can free up other revenues. The assembly of the future will have all of the tools that we have today, which is by code, which is by charter proposal to the voters to fix if something needs to be fixed. And so I don't think you can look at it as a net final answer, even if it is approved and the voters agree. It's just a thing. And hopefully I can dream of a day when this town finds itself in a position of having a wealth of housing and a functioning permitting and planning process that continues to grow and keep that stock healthy, right? Isn't that the prize we're aiming for? And so hopefully at some point the need becomes different. And then this could become that fund that helps to take, that strange design construction constraint we have, where if you're the first in on a development, you have to pay all of the expenses for the infrastructure, but everyone else can wait a certain amount of time. And then all of a sudden you've paid it all and they get in free, or people don't build because it's so expensive upfront. We can actually start to solve those problems when we have a dedicated resource to that effect while we're in this 10,000 homes race. And so to put it simply, I think the question of, do we tie the hands of the future? No more than our hands are tied right now.
Yeah. If I can just piggyback off of that, I think, even if there were a specific short-term rental tax, the underlying lodging tax could be changed by a future assembly. I think I just want to touch on that differentiation between uses. Like, I think it's really important to separate out the use types. And in fact, there's another item that will be before us on Tuesday with the short-term rental legislation that will help further define short-term rentals in code, making them more separate from inns or hotels. And that piece also, I think, does away with the bed and breakfast category too. So having them differentiated as uses in code, I think, is really important. And for the reason that Member Constant spoke to, which is they are pulling residential units off the market in a way that hotels are not. And so having a direct influence on supply and demand of housing. But I would also put forward that there's another differentiation. I think that with hotels, a single hotel can employ dozens and dozens of employees, where a single short-term rental may employ a cleaner every so often, as the unit turns over, or a property management company, and they might have some employees. But I think when we look at the economic benefit that hotels bring to Anchorage residents, it's not just in hosting tourists and tourists spending their money here. It's also that they employ a lot of Anchorage residents.
All right, Mr. Rivera.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I have three questions, and I'll just go ahead and, since I'm on the phone, just do all of them, and you all can handle them as you wish. First one's simple. I really appreciated Member Brawley's questions, and it sounded like Member Voland had responses in writing. So I'm wondering if it's possible to put those two together, Member Brawley's questions and the responses, and add those to the record. I think those will be helpful for me to review again in the future, and I believe for the public. Second is, and these second and third points are really just based off of my wisdom I've gleaned over the years. So the second is on support. So who is supporting this initiative should it get onto the ballot? And then third is, again, wisdom gleaned over the years. The successful ballot propositions that I've seen the voters approve have had some level of detail and certainty. Maybe not all of the details. I agree generally with what folks are saying, that the minutia are probably best handled after the vote of the people. But there is some amount of detail and certainty and guardrails put to the funding. And namely, I'm talking about the structure of both the alcohol tax and the ACE fund. And I really appreciated how those were structured, even though they may have had some flaws to them. Do you believe that the proposal that you are putting forward has the level of details that will give voters confidence in what they are voting on? Thanks.
So just to take the questions in order, responses to the questions, we will put a final review over them before having them circulated. They're just still in notes form. As for support, I think, Mr. Vaughan, you've had some discussions about support with some folks, but everyone is waiting to see if the question gets on the ballot. But there are some pretty strong community advocacy organizations who have expressed interest in having it as part of their efforts. And so I don't want to get ahead of the curve. We can talk later. And then in terms of detail and certainty, I kind of share your long view, and I maybe have come a little bit to the opposite conclusion that we have been, in my opinion, overly prescriptive in the last few charter amendment proposals we've put forward. And so we intended with this one not to direct a creation of a board or some oversight entity. This, in the end, really needs to reside between the mayor and the assembly, in the opinion of the sponsors, because this is the most direct work that we are doing right now. The 10,000 homes proposal is policy number one, our land use work. And so creating an arbitrary third party who is empowered to kind of take mastery or ownership of the landscape was something that we decided after the conversations about the ACE board and the trust and the other ones that have been created, that this is not the path we want to go down. And so in terms of the restrictions on the use, the very careful guide rail is that it has to be, or guardrail has to be, tied to the development of housing. Housing is the key missing ingredient. And so in much the same way as the charter speaks about tourism promotion, it's two words. Like, it doesn't create a board that's in charge or tells us how we have to spend it or proposes it. It's broad, and our intent is to have broad language. Now, again, if the concern about owner occupied is something we want to talk about, and I firmly agree with that element, we can put that in the whereases, we can put that in the action clauses. I just don't think we should put it in the charter language, because I don't want to tie the hands so tightly of the future that they cannot achieve the outcomes that we're trying to set before them. So that is at least my response, Mr. Wallen.
Yeah, my thinking is along the same lines. Should we decide collectively as a body to put this before voters, I will definitely be doing my darndest to whip as much support for it as possible. I do think this would be something that is popular with most voters, or I wouldn't bring it forward. But I also think it's responsive to the question that I often get asked, anytime these questions about zoning reform come up, or housing, and why aren't you doing something about short-term rentals? And so this is, I think, also an effort to get some community buy-in on that question. And then in terms of, not wanting to be sort of overly prescriptive or restrictive with how the fund is used. Just, from some of the reading that I've been doing, including books like Abundance by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson. There's some examples provided of when jurisdictions come up with things like this, but they put so many restrictions on it that it can't functionally be used creatively or flexibly to achieve desired outcomes. So I hope that answers some of your questions, Mr. Rivera. And yes, we will, like Mr. Constant said, go through our responses to Member Brawley's questions and then get those circulated to members.
They may come in the form of a memorandum or an AIM. Other questions? Ms. Brawley?
Yeah, thanks. And yeah, in the Q&A, I am appreciate if the sponsors bring an AIM. I'm not going to separately circulate those, but you guys have them. So yeah, definitely, I'm happy to see those shared. And I will also agree, I think keeping it broad and not putting a bunch of detail in the charter. A lot of the implementation issues that we've had have been when things are very specific and it does tie the hands, or it is something that maybe sounds good on paper and then doesn't work in the real world, so I'm certainly with you there. And I'll also say for my part, I don't see this as an either or with zoning. And I know I'm guessing that's not what, I'm seeing nods. That's not what anybody's saying, I don't think. But I've heard from some members of the public that there is this expectation or this idea that we should do this instead of that. So I just want to say it isn't all of the above strategy. Just to be super clear for those who feel otherwise, at least in my opinion. I did want to ask, since Member Johnson isn't here, I know he had an amendment, so I'm not asking him to speak to it, but I wonder if the sponsors have a thought on that. And then my other last question is just in general, we know this item is on the agenda Tuesday. There's many other things and we know that what gets set for the ballot is the deadline is January. So that is the end date. It's not, we can certainly do something sooner, but kind of what are you all thinking in terms of timing? And especially as we're moving into other pieces. Thanks.
So, just on the timing question, it's difficult to say. We'll see where the numbers are on the dais. We do have 21 public hearings, but this is in the 11s. We've kind of been through the public hearing process. What was the first part of the question? Yeah, I think that we don't have any objection to Member Johnson's amendment. I think insofar as it's possible, some of this conversation is driven by Girdwood, which unique to all of our communities in the municipality, it is under siege from this use. A massive percentage of its rental properties are utilized, and there is no way for them to see investment happen in their community other than by kind of market rate development, which means $1 million homes. And so they're caught in a bit of a vicious cycle. And I think that there is support between Mr. Wallen and myself to see something along those lines. Then Eagle River's Airbnbs can see some kind of improvements of investment in the community. That way, it's just a little bit more narrowly constructed for the benefit of places that are facing the challenges that we're starting to really grapple with relating to short-term rental usage.
Thanks. Yeah, I figured that was worth discussing.
Mr. Rivera, the amendment specifically identified 3 areas in the municipality and said as much as possible when the revenue is generated in these areas, the tax revenues shall be spent in these areas. Do you have the amendment, Mr. Gates?
Yeah, so
You want to read it? It's pretty straightforward.
yeah.
The effective part. Turn your mic on.
My voice doesn't carry so well. So this is an amendment adding language to the end of subsection B that's on page 2 in the middle, the dedication of housing infrastructure section, and just adding to the end the sentence to the maximum extent feasible, the tax on STR transactions in these regions of the municipality should be expended for the dedicated purposes only in their respective regions. 1, Anchorage Bowl, 2, Girdwood and Turnagain and Arm, and 3, Eagle River, Kuyak, and Birchwood. And then number 4 was delineation of specific boundaries of the separate regions for revenue and expenditure of the dedicated funding and directive for segregating the revenues by region was added to, I'm sorry, I read that together, but that number 4 is actually to add to section 2 on page 4 at the end, where we're asking that, directing the admin to produce an ordinance to submit to the assembly for implementing, and that would be the number 4 delineation in that ordinance by code of how to set those boundaries. So
Thanks. Mr. Rivera.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Gates, for walking through that. I guess I have a question, and I want to say that the answer to this question is yes, but I'm also not a tax expert. Would it be simple enough for collections to segregate the whatever revenue we collect by those 3 districts?
So that's
I guess I'm asking the administration if they have an
I have an answer, Felix. So there is a separate ordinance proposed right now that requires a registration of short-term rental units. And once that is in place, yes, then, because the properties will be taxed on their property identification, and it will be easily discernible in the current condition in which the short-term rental third parties are not following the law. They're violating the law by not providing that information. It is challenging, but there is that other ordinance that is moving forward.
Thank you.
Mr. Voland.
Thank you. So I actually think it would be interesting to ask Member Rivera and Member Martinez a question, broader than this specific ordinance. And thank you, Felix, for your thoughtful questions. But sort of one of my first ideas on this was because the 2 of you brought forward that budget amendment to create a housing trust fund. And so I guess that to me kind of set a little bit of a light bulb off of like, how could we grow that and really harness that over time? So whether or not you like this ordinance, I'm inspired by the 2 of you. I guess my question for you guys is kind of like, what were you sort of envisioning with the setting aside of that funding? I think we amended it down to $500,000. You had originally brought forward $1.5 million. Is this kind of stuff that I've talked about sort of along the lines of what you were thinking? Or I guess what were your ideas when you brought forward that budget amendment?
Yeah, thanks. I'll go ahead and get started. And is Member Martinez in the room?
He's on the phone.
Okay.
Oh,
Then
Matthew
I'll go
says
ahead
he
and get
hung
started,
up.
Member Martinez.
I
Oh,
guess,
okay.
yeah.
Well, then I'll just talk. Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you for the question, Member Voland. So I guess little moment of levity. I won't say that I haven't enjoyed seeing the housing fund included in various tax proposals. I don't know if that was a deliberate strategy to try to stroke my ego or not, but I enjoyed that folks were including that in your various tax proposals. But yeah, I mean, generally, and excuse the language, but I mean, generally the idea of that housing fund was to get shit done. And so that will take a different forms, and what I have heard you express verbally, and then what I see in this proposal, AO 2025-97, I think fulfills that objective of getting shit done when it comes to housing.
Okay, great. Thanks.
That is definitely the mission. If we're going to get there, we have to do something. And this is one of the somethings we can do. Or the voters can choose or not to do if the question gets to them. Anyone else with questions? Okay, I think then if we don't have anyone else with questions, we'll go ahead and prepare to adjourn this meeting and offer that in 24 hours, we'll be convening back in this room for a special meeting to address concerns relating to the civil emergency in Western Alaska and Anchorage's part in that. So that will be adjourned, and see you tomorrow.